You need to know the import of the First Opium War from 1839 to 1842. Obviously, a war between British and China, obviously over opium. The British the British desiring to import it fairly freely, legally. The Chinese wishing to stop this trade entirely. Now, with respect to the First Opium War, the very geographical factors which had impeded the Europeans with respect to entry into Africa. Remember, Africa was difficult to topographically enter, certainly coming by ship. Nevertheless, that's not the case with respect to China. As you can see by this map here, China is quite accessible to a sea power. You have these major rivers, the Huanghe, the Yangtze River, but of course, since much of the illegal importation of opium was coming in southern China, we have the Pearl River, which you can sail substantially up from by ship. And therefore, what you saw is that the British would be able to take advantage of this opportunity. It's having most impressive navy in the 19th century. And when I say that the British were successful in the First Opium War, they would prevail in the First Opium War, I by no means mean that they overran the country and dominated it. That's not possible. Coming from almost the other side of the world by ship to a huge population in place, established, that's not possible to do. But the British didn't have to do that. All they had to do with their superior navy is penetrate into the continent and take over key harbor facilities, whereupon you can import as much of anything you want. And that's exactly what the British did, especially in southern China along the Pearl River. This is a depiction of the HMS Nemesis destroying a Chinese ship in this war. Make a long story short, the Chinese surrendered and signed the famous Treaty of Nanking, which you can see here in 1842, bringing an end to the war. In the Treaty of Nanking, the Chinese were forced to surrender over the port of Hong Kong to the British. For an extended period of time, it was called a treaty port. There were many other treaty ports, but this is the most famous one. It essentially was given over to the British as a colonial holding, one that had a time period on it. It wasn't a permanent colonial holding. And so you end up with the political entity that you know today as Hong Kong. A few words about Hong Kong here. You can see Hong Kong's location in the south, surrendered over to the British, as I put on here, at the conclusion of the First Opium War in 1842. Since becoming a British colony of sorts, Hong Kong has economically prospered. 97% of its population is of Chinese ancestry. But this former colony of the British had a completely economic orientation. Its standard of living is quite high when you compare it with mainland China. But the British lease was up. Remember, it was a treaty port. The British lease was up, and in 1997, it was returned by law to the Chinese. This was a major point of celebration in China because China had always smarted at the notion of having to surrender over portions of their national territory to a foreign power who was trying to import drugs. They could do little about it, but up until 1997, they got peacefully the return of Hong Kong. It caused major celebrations in China because this is one of the national outrages of the 19th century, which still it has a substantial role in the Chinese psyche today, and understandably so. Now, the most important result of the First Opium War was that China's isolation was cracked. Remember, the Chinese prior to the 1839 were pretty much secure in their dominion in East Asia. Well, they were subdued essentially by the British as a function of the First Opium War. And you can see that here. China is forced open. And what the Chinese had to do was obviously cede over commercial control of large portions of their country. And I say commercial control because keep in mind it's really not possible to get into China, especially into the inner portions of the country where you find most of the population located in small agricultural settlements. You can't control that directly. All right. And what China did was they're in a bad situation. They're forced open by the British. And so they essentially said, hey, look, we're in a bad situation. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. I'm going to allow in the competitors of the British as well, so that we at least might have a chance of playing these foreigners off of each other. We're in a bad situation. You got to make the best you can. And so you can see is the core of China over here, characterized by this diagonal line, that's the British. And so the British got the lion's share of Chinese commercial opportunities. But as you can see, the other European powers were let in as well. You can see Russia getting a cut, all right, Germany getting a cut over here, the French getting a cut down over here. So this is a bad circumstance for China. They're forced open. And that's the critical observation that you need to make about the First Opium War. It indicates that Chinese isolation and essentially Chinese autonomy ends in 1839 and with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. All right, lest I ask you on a test, you know what the answer to that's going to be. Their isolation was cracked. And of course, the country was broken up into spheres of influence, which you can see here on this map. As you would suspect, this would result in the flood of yet more opium into the country, causing all kinds of problems. And by the way, you can see on this map over here, these little red dots in there, those are more treaty ports that were signed over by the Chinese to foreign powers. So you can see how subordinated China became. A great event of national shame for the Chinese. In fact, ultimately, opium would be legalized in the country, bringing with it a whole set of problems. In fact, there'd be a second Opium War as this problem intensified, but the most important one is the First Opium War. Opium consumption explodes as the 19th century progresses. This is it's often referred to as China as the period, the 19th century is referred to as the period of national humiliations, because they would become, many would say, a servile state to the Western powers. Now, it's not only that the problem, not only that drugs are now flowing into the country, but a whole set of foreign ideas and innovations are entering into the country that are upsetting traditional Chinese society, causing it to change rapidly. And when change comes rapidly, there's not enough time to adjust. People are displaced and disoriented, and they feel insecure. And I'm talking about the railroad, steamboats, and telegraph lines. All these things put out of business traditional Chinese mule cart transporters, camel transporters, river boatsmen, all out of business. In fact, you can see here by this image a depiction of an attack on a Russian paddle steamer by the Chinese. Innkeepers over much of the country were irate because their clients no longer passed their way because transportation routes changed, especially with the railroad. The desire to grow crops for Western markets threatened many small farmers who could not compete with interests that wanted their land to grow for the foreign market. All of a sudden, land values explode because you got access to foreign markets. Therefore, the rich are going to want to take over lands from the peasants. This is going to cause all kinds of problems. And the Qing dynasty, which was in power, was progressively impoverished by the fact that foreigners were draining off the traditional sources of commercial wealth with the appropriation of the taxes associated with their mandate. And the result, by the Qing dynasty, of course, if they're losing a lot of their taxation capacity to foreigners, well, they're not just going to accept that. They're going to double their amount of taxes on the local Chinese population that they had before to make up for the loss. So the Qing dynasty is increasingly hated as well by the Chinese because of the economic burdens being placed on them in terms of greater taxation, but also by the fact that it's the Qings were in power. The Qing is the same thing as the Manchu dynasty. They were in power when the foreigners came, bringing with them all these problems. And so there was a loss of faith for the Qing dynasty. Western medicines displaced the roles of ancient Chinese medics. Western weaponry, increasingly industrial weaponry, affronted or offended the honor of Chinese soldiery and military practices. In fact, one Western innovation, and I'll use the term innovation, is indicated here. Most problematic was that the missionaries brought in by the Westerners taught Christian conceptions that were contrary to Confucian ideals, contrary to traditional Chinese conceptions of the supernatural world. Very offensive. And when you add in the fact that the missionaries used money to attract believers, many of the recruited Chinese Christians were morally questionable types who joined the church for very material purposes. This is a photo of missionary Farthing, who was imported into Shanxi province. These foreign missionaries were converting more and more Chinese, ever threatening the Chinese identity and seeming to legitimize the Western colonialism while preaching acquiescence to the continuation of Western imperialism. They were despised by many Chinese. In fact, the boiling resentment of the Chinese to being corrupted in a multifaceted way, the boiling resentment to being treated like second-class citizens in their own country in the 19th century resulted in the rise of a group you want to take note of. This is the rise of the Boxers. The Boxers were a collection of Chinese nationalist militias. These are informal groups of patriots who went around China giving demonstrations of martial arts. That's why they were called Boxers, because from the perspective of foreigners, they were focused on just doing ritual calisthenics and martial arts displays. Well, that was what their cover was. When in reality, they were a secret society that called themselves the Fists of Righteous Harmony. These martial arts displays were a cover because while they could simply say they were just giving demonstrations of traditional Chinese arts to the populace, they were in reality fomenting resistance to the European presence by inciting Chinese nationalism against the corrupting foreign presence. By the early months of 1900, the Boxers numbered in the thousands and roamed the countryside freely. It was in that year, 1900, that you got what's called the Boxer Rebellion. And you need to take note of the Boxer Rebellion. It occurred in 1900. The Boxers rose up to kill thousands. And when I say kill thousands, it wasn't thousands of foreigners. Very few, comparatively, foreigners were killed. Most of the people killed by the Boxers were foreign missionaries, those who were thought to have been corrupted by foreigners. In fact, missionary Farthing here in that previous edition, the photo I showed you here, was one of those who were killed during the Boxer Rebellion. You can look at this image here. Well, you can't look at the labeling very well on here, but this is a photograph of converted Chinese Christians, and of course they would have been prize targets of Boxers. In fact, this is a photograph from a book published in 1901 during the Boxer Rebellion, or right after it. The book was titled A God of Deliverances, the story of the marvelous deliverances through the sovereign power of God of a party of missionaries when compelled by the Boxer Rebellion to flee from Shanxi. The Boxers, at their height, would actually lay siege for, I believe it was 4 to 6 weeks to the city of Beijing, where much of the foreign presence was concentrated. In fact, you have a photo here of what a Boxer really would have looked like, by and large, standing outside the city walls, waving red and white nationalist banners. Make a long story short, the Boxers were put down by the foreigners. The Boxers did not succeed in ejecting the foreigners, but the rise and demise of the Boxers spelled the end of the Qing dynasty. They clearly had no control over the Boxers. The Qings did. The Qing dynasty did. They were the major casualty of the Boxer Rebellion. In fact, the Manchu dynasty was seen, or the Qing dynasty, in large part, as being responsible for this whole circumstance. That's a simplification to be true, but one that was made.